Hello, y'all, and welcome to oyo.run, your online resource for the self-coached runner. In this episode, I interview and introduce my friend, colleague, and the physical therapist, Carl Stones. I give a short intro, bit of a janky intro, I think, to Carl in the episode itself. But there's a few notes I just want to make before we get started because of some things that went on in the recording, but also just making sure that we're really clear on the dreaded disclaimer. So it's really important to make sure that everybody recognizes that anytime someone in the therapeutic medical space gives advice, that advice is meant to be also checked with against other medical information. And that's really good reason for these kinds of disclaimers. I know sometimes people are like, why do I need to hear about this? But especially related to self-coaching, it's very important that whatever you hear from me or from Carl, and anybody else for that matter, needs to be balanced with your own experience, but also with advice from medical professionals. Because we have blind spots, and also Carl will be speaking in a general way and not really relating to the specific needs that you might have. So sometimes he may say something that is relevant at a general level, but exactly the wrong information for you on a personal level. So I just wanted to make sure that I made clear that there's this kind of disclaimer in this episode and any other episodes I do with Carl. We'll see whether or not these disclaimers continue in every episode, but I just want to make sure that it's very clear that Carl's presence here is a gift, and he is not representing all physical therapists in all time. He's representing his point of view, and he's offering it to us, his expertise and his knowledge to us. And so it's really important that we be held accountable and responsible for our own decision-making and to balance those decisions with medical people. Another thing I need to make clear is somewhere along the line in here, Carl's newborn, Andy, makes an appearance. Carl's window of opportunity for recording is in an area in which he's also providing childcare. And so I'm stoked that Andy can make an appearance. Sometimes she'll be we'll be more aware of her than in other cases. But unless it's just absolutely overwhelming, I'm usually going to keep it in. So just want you to be aware that this is the way it's going to roll in episodes with me and Carl, is that Andy will always be potentially present. I think Malcolm, his cat, makes an appearance for a little bit, but I don't know that you'll even notice that. So, and then the last piece of note is right near the end of the episode, as I'm asking Carl to sort of come through and give a bit of a synopsis or a look forward, his recording device went offline. And so I'm just going to indicate that with a little sound sparkle so that you know that happened. There's no way for me to track what he said in that interim. Just know that he said a thing, he's saying things, some things he said go away, and then he's back. So I'll just indicate that with a little sparkly soundtrack. So anyway, I appreciate y'all for listening. I'm very excited for the potential of Carl's insights relative to specific situations that we have, but also generally in terms of thinking more about self-coaching and what's important. It's very rare to have someone come on consistently in this kind of a role. I'm very thankful to Carl for his willingness and excitement to participate in this. So without further ado, I'll send you the episode I call Intro to Carl. Godspeed, y'all. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the oyo.run project. My name is Steve, and I am your host. I am very happy to be joined for the first time by one of what I'm hoping and he's committed to is being a consistent co-host, Carl Stones, who is a physical therapist in Ohio, a former competitive runner at the pro level, collegiate level, high school level, and colleague and good friend. And I'm very excited for you all to meet Carl and get to know him, his style, and his expertise. So, hello, Carl. Welcome to the Oyo.run project.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. So let me give you guys a little bit of an intro on how I know Carl. I think the first time I met Carl, I messed this up when I introduced Katie too. So she was like, "No, we met some other time before that." So I'm sure you'll rectify my. But I remember there was, I don't know if he's still around, but there was a coach in Austin who worked mostly with high school kids, named my brain is wild.
Chris Schrader.
Chris Schrader, yes, Chris Schrader. And Chris Schrader used to always have high school kids that did Sunday long runs or Saturday long runs. And once or twice, as a former UT athlete and also working at Runtex and then into Rogue in the years that I was at Rogue, I just knew Chris from and really had a lot of respect for him. He's a bit of a wild man. A lot of people are critical of him, but I always think he's got the best interest at heart for every kid that he works with. But it was really hard to miss Carl because Carl is extremely tall. He's very tall, very powerfully built, which is not your typical look for a distance runner. And then I don't remember that we actually had conversation or where we had conversation, but I was definitely paying attention to Carl. He had a really good high school career and then went and ran for the University of Tulsa and was coached by Steve Gully, who I also had a close relationship with because I almost ran at Baylor University in my collegiate career, and he was the coach at Baylor, and we would talk almost every week in our recruiting calls, and I just came to respect him a lot. Turned out Baylor's expense and the idea that I could run at the University of Texas basically won over, and so I ended up going to UT and not to Baylor, but I had a lot of respect for Coach Gully. And then I got to meet Coach Gully. I'd spent a lot more time with Coach Gully when he was coaching at the collegiate level. And that's when he was always coaching at the collegiate level. He was coaching at Tulsa. And that's where I got to spend more time seeing Carl race and run. And when we had a pro team here in Austin called Rogue AC, Rogue Athletic Club, and I invited Carl to run with us then. And so then I had a multi-year, incredibly positive working relationship with Carl and his wife, Sarah, who may get mentioned in this episode as well, who Carl then decided to become a PT. And part of his process of being PT was mentored by Peter Kroon, who is our local best PT, in my opinion. He's incredible. And so there's a lot of resonance between Carl and I as people, but also a whole lot of resonance between us philosophically and coaching-wise and history. And so I'm really excited to have these ongoing dialogues with Carl related to the body generally, but then anything else that we decide to get down to. So, Carl, with that sort of janky intro, why don't you fill us in a little bit on your running journey or the journey from your perspective, and then we'll go into some topics.
Yeah. So I kind of came to running, I feel like the way that a lot of people do, which is playing other sports, and mine was soccer primarily. And running went from being kind of a supportive activity for my soccer, to, hey, I'm enjoying this and considerably better at this than I am at kicking a ball around. So, I ran in high school with, for Coach Andy Jackson at Round Rock High School. And used to go out and do those long runs with Chris Schrader. I was never one of his athletes per se, but I always I had a good relationship with Chris. And
Coach
Jeff
Jackson
Cunningham
wouldn't have been cool with it, right? He was not. Coach Jackson wasn't the biggest Chris Schrader fan either.
He liked him. I think that his way, was just, take him with a grain of salt. But he was supportive of us going out and doing the long runs. As long as there was a boundary between, you can do the long runs. That's part of the training. Chris is not advising or writing our other training. So I was like, all right, I get that. That's fine. Um, so yeah, so had a decent high school career. I think the theme of every level that I ran at was kind of, I started okay, um, and typically built, got better each year at each level. So never thought that I would run in college for the first couple years of high school, and then it kind of became a reality as we got a little bit closer. So I don't think that people weren't really reaching out to me as a junior a whole lot necessarily. It wasn't until my senior cross country season. But along that way, one of the other coaches who's still pretty prominent in the Austin running community, who was coaching high schoolers at the time and who would go out for those Sunday long runs, was Jeff Cunningham.
Mm.
And so I had a good relationship with Jeff too. Jeff ran for Coach Gully at Baylor. And so he put me in touch with him. I, like other people, heard Tulsa and thought, mixed it up with Tucson, Arizona for a little bit. And then, got, I don't know. I liked I liked what I saw with the program. So I went there and kind of restarted that whole thing, a bumpy first year and a half, couple injuries here and there. And then kind of got my feet under me, and started to make some good improvements, that kind of built. We made it to the cross country national meet my senior year, qualified for the regional meet on track as a sophomore, junior, and senior, and then finally made it to the NCAA meet as a senior, and stuck out the last All-American spot. So figured if I was good enough to do that, then I could maybe keep looking at it as an option, without people laughing me out of the room, when I told them I just wanted to keep running. So and yeah, that's when we got in contact, and then went to Rogue for a few years in Austin. Kind of bounced around, ended up finishing up that 4-year block back in Tulsa, and ran at the Olympic trials, which was a big part of the goal. And yeah, so that was kind of the running portion. And then, you mentioned Sarah. We met in Austin through the group, and so after those 4 years were over, we had been dating for a few years, and she moved back to Indiana to do her master's. So I followed her out there. Applied for schools in the area, got into the University of Indianapolis for physical therapy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of PT journey. But went there, and Sarah's in college coaching, so I've been just kind of bouncing around the Midwest and Ohio, Appalachia ever since.
So as a collegiate athlete and as a pro athlete, your event was the steeplechase, which is, for most of our listeners, they probably have an idea of what it is, but they probably don't really grok it. It's not, unless they're really into track and field. So tell people a little bit about the difference between, let's say you're a 1,600, 3,200 meter high school kid, and then you make the transition to college, and then why the steeple? Because it is as a former steepler myself, the reason I got into the steeple was I wasn't fast enough to run the 5K, 10K at my level, at the collegiate level for my team. And so I needed to score points to keep my coach happy. And so I steepled and scored points at the conference meet every year. And I am the very opposite of Carl in terms of size and stature. I am a 5'7" on my tallest day, but the steeple allows this like gritty toughness to be its primary thing. So your height is really not as important as your ability to recover between hurdles, and then your mindset on being able to close. And I'm always, as a collegiate athlete and as a pro athlete, one of my strengths has always been closing, and people who can close usually make good steeplers. That's why I always liked milers moving up to the steeple more than I liked 5K runners coming down to the steeple, because milers knew how to close. And if you can't close in a steeple, it's the difficulty of the event. It will It will crush you. It is too hard to manage 4 hurdles and a water jump every lap, you know? So,
Yeah.
and we've got Andy makes her first appearance in the podcast.
Yeah. Sorry about that. She
It's all good. We're happy for this. This makes me really happy.
usually likes that swing. She's probably just getting a little tired. She needs her first little nap of the day. Yeah, I think I guess we'll get into Andy in a minute. So we'll do a delayed
We'll finish the
introduction.
steeple and then move to Andy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of one of those events that there's a little, I don't think that runners have a reputation of a lot of good general athleticism. But I think it's one of those events that lends itself to that. It's tough to be super uncoordinated and not have a little bit of, certainly power and athleticism. And it's tough to not have those and do well in the steeple. And then, yeah, I mean, it's for me, it was I was in the same situation. There weren't many events that I was, by the time I was a senior, I felt like I could have scored in every distance event at the conference meet and maybe qualified for the regional meet in a few different ones. But as a freshman, I went in and I was second in the conference as a freshman in the steeple, and I could not have done that in any other event. So it was a great kind of place to find that was my spot on the team, which was nice. And I was able to kind of springboard that. It gave me a lot of confidence and use that as a good springboard. And I just happened to kind of stick with it for that whole period of time.
Did you ever think about moving out to the 5 or the 10? If you would have gone, would you have gone to the 5 or down to the 15? Probably not the 10, right? I mean, I know you were a really good cross guy, but how did that play out?
Yeah, I think, you kind of mentioned it earlier, and I'm big for a runner. So, 6'4", plus, and usually race weight was like 180 pounds. But anywhere between 180 and 190, depending on what time of year it was and, where we were training. So that's not the longer you go, the more that tends to be a disadvantage. So I think that I felt, at times like I could run a good 10K, but I don't think that I could have been as competitive. I could have time trialed a decent 10, go out to California and get the perfect weather and all this stuff and, run okay. But I probably, I think one of my bigger regrets was not racing the mile in the 1500 more. Cause I had these little glimmers of like, I'll just race a 15 and, run not world or national class, but well enough that it was like, I should probably should have raced that a little bit more. I might have been, I felt like I could have been a sub 4 miler, which would have been meaningful to me. But I don't know that.
I think you and I we're in the same boat. I think I ran a 4:02 at a conference meet in a mile indoors, but never thought coaching was different for me in the era. I'm older than you are, and in my era, we kind of stuck to our event, and especially because I was running expected to be steepling and always needed to try to get my qualifier. Back then, it was a descending order list. It wasn't a regional. I would have qualified for regionals every year if they'd had a regional system when I was in, but they didn't. And so there was a need to try to attempt to get it in an event. And so I didn't really run the 15 very often. I ran lots of I ran a couple of 4x15s. Texas Relays used to have a 4x15 or a DMR, and I would run the mile leg. But usually those were affairs in which I'm a good closer. And I like to race. And so usually I was an anchor, and almost rarely you're going to run the fastest time on the anchor because it just ends up slowing down and doing things. So I'm the same way. I feel like I probably would have been a sub 4 minute miler, but didn't take that opportunity. And it's like you said, it's like getting that OTQ, the Olympic trials qualifier. I never got to the chance to do that. That's the one missing thing in my repertoire. But sub 4 is also sort of sitting there as that number that, it's the relevance to the rest of the world. Although now with the number of high school kids running it and almost every collegiate, I mean, at the times things have moved so much faster in the last 3 to 4 years with the technology and the shoes and then the coaching quality and then the competition just being so more consistently faster.
Yeah.
That, the sub 4 minute mile is not quite the same cachet as it had. But for people our age or older, it still means a lot. So I know how you feel about that.
Yeah. So that was, that was the only thing. But I mean, I don't know I can't imagine that there are very many people that walk away from, whatever they're doing with no regrets or no what ifs. And I mean, overall, it was a, still continues to be a super impactful part of my life. So still on that journey. But that, competitive phase was something that I'll always kind of, look back on fondly, for various reasons. So
this is interesting. My brother's son is a very competitive baseball player. And for some reason, he doesn't want to play baseball in college. And my brother reached out to me and said, will you talk to my son? Because you're one of the few people I know who can actually tell him, what he might be missing. And when I talked to him, I was like, you cannot miss this opportunity. It is the defining decision I made. It was never a decision for me because I was going to be an Olympian, right? I wanted to win an NCAA championship and I wanted to be an Olympian. Those were my goals as a young boy. I mean, even before I was even a teenager, I was already crazily thinking in that category. So when I talked to my nephew, I was just adamant about the fact that you have no idea. You go from being the big man on campus at a college, if you're a good enough runner to be able to be running at a collegiate or playing baseball at a collegiate level, then you're a big man on campus. You're known. And to then move into a college environment where you're just like everybody else, that by itself is a really challenging adjustment. And then to not have a community of guys or girls that you already know something about because you have this mutual interest and mutual experience level. Anyway, not to bag on my brother's son, but I'm not sure what he'll do. But I think it just the reason I bring it up is it highlights, I'm with you, that the core friends and the core experiences that made me go from a boy to a man were definitely happening at the collegiate level. And then pushed me into my, pseudo responsible adulthood under this pressure of what's next, which I think is a really good thing for young men and women coming out of in a competitive workspace, trying to find a place to, and then the leadership skills that come from being on a team and leading a team, you then are you're much better prepared for what comes next. And then you're also have experience that many employers are looking for, even today. So, I think it's formative. So also, one thing that I'm really interested in is, why did you decide to be a PT? Like, what was it, and when was it that you began to think around that topic in a direction of where your interest was as a younger athlete, but then when that moved from interest to, I might do this as a profession?
Yeah, so my joke with this is always that I made the decision when I learned that you didn't need to take organic chemistry for PT school. Just you had to for med school, but not PT school. So that's when I decided. No, I mean, I think that I'm sure we'll get into this, but with any I don't know, any kind of person who's run for any amount of time, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who hasn't dealt with some kind of a frustrating injury. It's an activity. I wouldn't say that it's a high injury rate, per number of hours that people do it. But people do it for a lot of hours. And so, You tend to see, the longer you do it, the more you're going to experience various injuries and hiccups. And so I was um, I was not an exception to that rule. I had a couple of kind of bigger injuries, stress fractures, things like that in high school. Um, Same thing, a couple big ones in college, couple big ones post collegiate. I feel like every one of those phases, I probably had, maybe two pretty big injuries that I dealt with, and had to get through, which is not a whole lot considering what some people deal with. But I think it not just the injuries necessarily, but just kind of my experience dealing with those each
Mm.
time. And a lot of that changed based on who I was working with. There were injuries that I dealt with, like my stress fracture in high school, where they were kind of like, oh, it's broken, it's going to heal on its own. So, no PT, which now I kind of know is like, I was really fortunate to come back from that and not re-fracture. Um, but I think that, in working with various people, and PTs, athletic trainers, whatever, I think that over that time, I found things that really, really helped me. But I also found things that were really, really unhelpful, that I was kind of like, man, why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't this the standard of care? So, somewhat approaching it from that standpoint, where it's kind of like, hey, this is a very viable profession. And there were a couple different things, that I could have gone into probably that would have been similar. But as far as, kind of joining what I'd consider like an evidence-based profession, for the most part, and being able to maybe have an effect, or save one person, those same kind of headaches and heartaches, and going through that process, and just kind of give some guidance. That was really attractive to me. um and I've never been a uh just sit at the desk and crunch numbers kind of person. That would do me in. So matched from a lot of those lenses. And it's that's always the cliche answer that you hear with PT school, at interviews, is, "Oh, I just want to help people." But I think, beyond helping people, you see that in two different ways. And you see people who go in and they're like, I want to fix people. And,
Mm.
I want to, like, I've got these magic hands, and I want to be, and I think that there's a level of, yeah, you want to help people, but there's like a selfishness and kind of an ego to that, um, that I think ultimately is not good for the patient. Um, and then the other side of that you have is like, I want to teach people these things that took me a long time to figure out, so that they can do this on their own, so that all those experiences that you build up over time, dealing with your own stuff, and being able to kind of maybe put that into a capsule. And some people choose not to take it, and some people won't. They'll kind of miss the plot, and that's okay. But having that ability to just kind of be like, hey, you know let's let's give you the tools that you need you know to manage most of this on your own. Because I think that ultimately, if you can't make any of those decisions, and you're not working with a healthcare provider that's giving you the tools to make those decisions, um it's not sustainable to to have somebody that you're leaning on with that kind of frequency and duration every single time that something pops up. So, um, for me, that was, those are various different things that kind of go into it. And they're not all reasons that came to me all at once. Some of that is, experience. I've been doing it about 6 years now. I had that gap. I was older than a lot of my classmates, just because I had that, 5 year gap of running competitively after college. Yeah, that's, the long answer, I guess. Or maybe it's a short answer. I don't know.
One of the things I find that this podcast is going to be continuing to pull as a thread is the idea of legacy, or the idea of where we came from, both as athletes, but even at a much more primal level. But you had an opportunity to be worked on. I don't know exactly the term we use in physical therapy. I always said worked on. How would you use that word? What is you? I guess the way
Uh,
Peter did it was he did work on people, but what what is the?
yeah, I think that I think worked. You know, it depends on what you're having done. I think that when I first started working with Katie and Peter, and I think that we've talked about this in the past a little bit, but you know, that was one of those things. I think that Katie and Peter are phenomenal at what they do, and I think that they're these. I mean, they're just treasure troves of knowledge, especially with, you know, with things like running. And but when we started working with them, they're also very good manual therapists, right? They're very good at, you know, um, doing that hands-on work that kind of makes you feel better. And so for me at that point, like that was what I saw. That was the big shiny thing in the room. And so if you asked me then, I would certainly say worked on. Sorry, I've got Malcolm contributing too. Um, so I would say worked on, but I think that that was part of the trap that I fell into, is that that was my focus, and that was what I kind of was like, man, I need them to work on me, right? I need them to fix me. I need them to do this. And what I was missing that they were preaching was like everything else, right? Like everything else that I was supposed to be doing. And those hands-on techniques were meant to like, hey, we're going to help you feel better and keep you running, which is highly valuable. But like, there's all this other stuff that you probably need to be doing better, that you could do better if you chose. And so, I mean, if you asked me now, you know, if I had had that perspective then I would have said, I don't even know if I would say, you know, I don't even know if I would use the term work. I might use the term like teach or learn. You know, they were teaching me and I was learning from them. And I certainly, that's not to say I didn't learn anything from them. You know, I learned a ton from them, and they were a big part of the reason, you know, I had kind of fallen out of you know, PT had fallen out of favor with me for a little while because I'd done some internships at these kind of mill clinics where it's like everybody goes in and gets an ice pack and ultrasound and the same 4 exercises. And I was like, man, I can't do this. And it wasn't until I started to work with them and shadow them that I was like, nah, I can do this. This is really what I want to do. So I probably should have mentioned them and the reason that I wanted to be a PT. But yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
I
why.
think that it's a perspective, just a perspective shift. And it depends on how, you know, where you are and when you have those interactions, and even that, you know, that, you know, duality that, you know, working on versus learning from, you know, if we want to separate it, is something that I'm pretty, you know, attentive to now with my patients, because I know how easy it is to fall into those like magic bullet easy fix traps when you're hurt.
Yes, the looking for the magic bullet. Yeah.
Yep.
So we jumped into it, but I in Austin, Texas, I moved here in 1988 to attend the University of Texas, and then went to work at the local running shoe store. And by the time I showed up at that running shoe store, already there was a orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Ted Spears, who was offering free injury clinics at the store for anybody that had any issues. And Dr. Spears was very unusual in the fact that he was an orthopedic surgeon, but he was extremely interested in what was going on in the runner's body. And he was also a very adept marketer. Not that that was his main MO, but he was just good at it because he was a laconic, aw shucks, country talking Texas guy who just really understood runners, and his office was right behind the running shoe store that we were at, and so he would come over and do injury clinics pretty consistently. That's how I first met Peter Kroon. And then they decided to because he was his main PT at his spot. So Dr. Spears would spend the early mornings doing surgeries, and then he would spend the late morning, early afternoon being there as his PTs were working on various running related injuries. And again, I think Dr. Spears is not given anywhere near enough credit. Near the end of his tenure, People were just, I guess, and when you're ubiquitously the only resource, and your resourcing is everywhere, sometimes people begin to start to talk smack about that, which is totally sad to me, because Dr. Spears, as he got older, he was just more and more interested in each individual person. And so he would tend to talk your ear off, and it wasn't about himself. It was about where you were and then how his life lessons might respond to that. Anyway, this is turning into a legacy of Austin running in a way. But I want part of this to be a part of how Peter and Katie became so important to what the running culture is in Austin, because they still are the main PTs that runners go to. And anytime anybody asks me if they have an injury, I'm like, go to Mondo, which is the name of their clinic. So, and at the time in Austin and in Texas generally, you couldn't see a physical therapist without getting a doctor's note. And so a lot of times physical therapists were stuck not being able to run outside. It was just much easier for them to be housed within a doctor's auspices, and that's how Peter got to that position. But he was also teaching physical therapy down at Texas State in San Marcos, which is about 30 miles south of Austin, and he has a unique Peter has a unique PTing pedigree. The way he operates and his mindset around it very much aligns with mine, because it was a nervous system model, one which said much of what's going on here is happening between things, not necessarily at the location that you think it is, but it's at the location you think it is, but it's also at these other in-between places. One of those in-between places being your brain, which is the main operating center for much of this stuff going on. And already when I first met Peter, I was like, this is a guy who gets what I think is actually happening. As a lay runner and then as a coach for many years, he and I just synced up really, really well. So anyway, I think that I want to honor the relationship that Dr. Spears built with people, and how important that is for any of our listeners who are thinking about self-coaching. Finding a doctor and or PT. Now, sometimes doctors don't make sense. Depends on what your injury is. Overuse kind of stuff, you're almost better off in most cases avoiding a doctor. I don't want to say that because everyone should see one. Again, there's a disclaimer to make here that each situation is unique. But most overuse injuries are not really. A doctor is designed to work with traumatic stress, with stuff that comes in really like a thief in the night, right? Those things are more doctor necessary. And Texas over the last 10 years has shifted to, you can go see a PT without a doctor's script, as long as you're, so that was a requirement of, you couldn't even see a physical therapist without insurance in Texas for so long. And now I just think it's such a better way of doing things for most runners. They need a physical therapist. So anybody listening to this, if you don't already have a manual therapist who's doing some kind of manipulation of blood flow and muscular work, you probably should. But also you need someone who can help you see the blind spots you have. And Carl and I are going to be talking about this over and over in every episode we do together. And we're going to not necessarily frame it in this giant, ubiquitous, overwhelming way, but more play these things as they lay. But generally, it was Peter and Katie and Peter and Dr. Spears who really made, it's crazy when I go to other places how poorly set up other cities are and other programs are, that professional groups or collegiate groups have to go out looking for the right mix. And I just was like in the water in the 90s and the early aughts and then the teens, because of the work Dr. Ted Spears did and his ability to hire just the most badass PTs who understood the runner, but also stood outside of running. One thing to say about Peter is he's a judo expert. He was like a world-class judo practitioner, and brings that mentality to his work that really adds another layer. So anyway, I'd like you just to talk a bit about the legacy piece here, but more around as much as you want, but also the legacy piece on how that is wormed into your way of operating as a physical therapist is, I think, really important for people to get.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, I kind of talked about Katie and Peter there. Dr. Spears did my, my one of my big eight injuries post collegiately was stepping on a loose car part in the road on a warm up over to the Texas School for the Deaf. Is that the one that's on where we used to do those workouts? So and trying to hobble over. So he did. He ended up doing an ankle kind of reconstruction surgery for me. Um, but even then, he was very, I work with a lot of surgeons now, or we I should say we get referrals from a lot of surgeons who are very knife happy. So like when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and that's very evident sometimes. And Spears was not like, he was like, this is an option, but let's maximize everything else that we have, right, without having to take the risk of anesthesia or whatever it is, right? And see if we can do this. And so Katie and Peter, I had a good relationship with them because they were kind of doing, I would say just kind of like prehab with our team for a little while. We'd go in once a week, um, and they kind of helped me manage that process. Not just kind of the conservative management, but then once I did have surgery, that process moving out, and it was so much different. Than anything I had done before, because I'd been in PT clinics, and I would have, like I said, when I was doing, internships in college, I was in other PT clinics where it was not the same. And it's almost to a point, I think that physical therapy is valuable as a profession, but when people tell me that they're injured, I don't even tell them, well, go see a physical therapist, because the the spectrum that you can get, from people telling you like, oh, well, you have an ankle injury because, your left upper trap is tight. And you're like, yeah, well, maybe wouldn't go with that, initially. The number of people, doctors, physical therapies who give people, negative messages where it's like, well, of course you're injured, you're running, it's going to ruin your knees, it's going to whatever. Um, and so I mean, just I think like, I would call it like a very running forward approach that they took, fitness forward approach, whatever it is, activity forward. They were doing everything that they could to keep you doing the activity, and not just telling you, oh, well, your knee hurts, so you should take 6 weeks off, because that's the easy answer every single time. Like, if I can get you to stop doing whatever's irritating your body for 6 weeks, it's gonna feel better in 6 weeks. But it introduces a myriad of other issues, coming out of that. Like, you're lowering your physical capacity to handle that thing. And so I think that was one of the things that I really took from them. And like I said, I had, my waters were a little bit muddied at times. And so some of this is what I took from them at that time in my life. And a lot of it is what I have taken from them in looking back. Because I do look back at those things a lot, and I think about it. Um, so, and that's been something that's, I think carried over a lot with me, is just, it's not just, it's not cookie cutter protocols. It's not this, it's not that. It's getting an idea of who the person is in front of you. There's not believe it or not, there's not a big magic black book of exercises that PTs are the sole guardians of, that, if you're hurt with this, you do these. I mean, it's just, you have to get an idea of who it is in front of you. What are you dealing with? And so I think that Katie and Peter did a phenomenal job of that. Not just like, is there tissue involvement that we need to be worried about? What's the extent of that? How does that tie in? But also just like, who's the human being in front of me? Who's sitting here? What are they going through? What is this injury doing to them psychologically? What were they dealing with psychologically before the injury that maybe was relevant to that. How are we going to put all of this together and kind of combining the I don't know what I'd say, but combining the structural and capacity type things with more of the what you might call the woo, and how do we kind of blend that and meld it and give you an individual program that you're going to feel good about, and that's going to we hope be the best plan for you moving forward. So they were the first, and not to say that they were the first people to ever do that, but they were the first people that I really saw doing that. And even now, I think as we get more knowledge translation and more tools available, you still don't see that many people doing it the way that they're doing it. I mean, when we go back into town, we usually stop by the clinic and say hi. And I mean, it's still run very well. And I think that there are, they do it in their own special way. It's kind of true to them. And so I think some people don't, that you're going to have people that fall through the cracks that want a slightly different exposure, whatever that is. Some people want, essential oils in a one-on-one closed room. And, that's not their clinic. Their clinic it is busy, all the time. I think the most stressful thing I've ever dealt with was trying to keep my 2-year-old, out of trouble while we were visiting them, and they had, a bunch of people doing different stuff in the clinic. But it's just, yeah, I mean, it's still, it's unique. It continues to, I think, it's still, even if it's gaining a little bit more traction, I think that it continues to be an incredibly special environment. I think that if every PT was like that, we would be in a much, if every healthcare practitioner was like Katie and Peter, we'd be in a much better place.
Yeah, the one of the things about legacy is that there's the legacy of the people we know and the people who have impacted our ability to consider our experience. I mean, if you think about anybody you think about your parents, your mother and your father, even as you age, maybe even more as you age, you begin to recognize more and more the legacy of patterns and habits and choices and decisions that they've made to keep you safe or help you out. And I think our listeners would do well to consider that their body is a legacy, that their physical body is more than their thumb or their finger or their foot or their aching knee or their lower back, that this is a unit that can't easily, we break it down because as humans we have this ability to conceptualize, and it's helpful for us to use concepts to clarify complex and complicated situations. Yet we are all in a body, and your finger, move it a little and you realize it's completely connected to the whatever your finger metatarsals are. I guess they're metatarsals, but they're whatever those are.
Yeah. Metacarpals,
yes. And then that moves up into your wrist and then up into your arm. And this legacy of our body is one of the things I wanted to touch on in this initial intro episode about how much listening to that legacy and what it is to have a body and pay attention to it is to the process of being a runner. And it's even more essential to those folks who are self-coaching, because as a coach, I know how many people ask me to diagnose their injury, which is fair because I have 50 years of running experience and 30 years of coaching experience, and I've seen a lot of things. But it's still, my first step is, well, tell me what you're feeling. And it's remarkable how few people actually relate well to their body. And the first time they will relate, the place they're most likely to relate to their body is when they're injured or they're feeling the beginnings of an injury. And they recognize that they immediately use their mindset is going to be very negative because it's going to complicate and make more challenging what's going on in their experience of running. So I'd really love to get your take on this idea of this legacy. And then from this framework, either as an athlete yourself or as a physical therapist or both, however you want to intertwine that, this will really help people get an idea about get a better introduction to you and the sort of the place that we're speaking to them, which is, and I know you and I are very similar in our point of view on this, that we recognize the need for breakdown, but yet we're still seeing the body more holistically to the ability that we can. And so there's a lot there I'm asking you to unpack. Maybe we can just start chatting about it and figure out where we go from here. But it's such an important part. That's why I wanted you to be as early in this series of episodes that I did, so we could make this exact point that, number one, your body is part of a legacy and patterning. Number two, you can't just listen to parts. You have to pay attention to the whole at some level. And three, it's not a problem. It's not necessarily the worst case scenario that you have a barking calf, right? So anywhere you want to go with that, Carl, feel free, and then we'll keep chatting around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of one of those, you know, which direction to start. But I mean, ignorance is bliss, until the shit hits the fan, and then that's kind of when, and then that's when I'm seeing a lot of people is when when the shit hits the fan. Running's beautiful, running's great, when everything feels good and you're running PRs, but how do you handle it when it's not? And so, and I'm sure that this will probably be a running theme of things that I talk about, but I tend to view things, on a spectrum largely. And so you have one end of the extreme and the other end of the extreme, and then what we probably need to be doing most of the time is finding a happy medium somewhere in that gray area. But I certainly have people who come in who have an unhealthy hyper awareness of everything in their body, and it gets overwhelming. It's like, yeah, my knee hurts, but 6 weeks ago I was playing ultimate frisbee and I strained my shoulder, and I think that changed the way that my diaphragm was working, and then the diaphragms can and you kind of go down, and just the time that it takes for me to unpack that and kind of I don't know if it's Bernoulli's principle, but like the order of magnitude that it takes to refute bullshit is so much higher than it takes to spout bullshit. And so there are times where it gets tricky, but I would almost rather have somebody who's at least taken the time to try to develop that awareness, even if they, overshot the moon by a couple million miles. I would much rather have that than some of the most challenging patients I have are these high school kids who come in, and it's just like, you ask them a question and they're like, I don't know, I don't really know. And you're like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, I'm asking you if this hurts. And you're like, yeah, like, and you get it. The other end of that spectrum is people who don't and I don't know, I can't feel what people are feeling, so it's not totally fair for me to say this, but I kind of, I feel like there are people that just, they don't know the difference between like a stretch discomfort and a pain. It's like and that gets so challenging, and it's, if that's kind of your baseline, good luck taking this on as as an ongoing hobby. I think, having some awareness of just, like the individual, so like having an awareness of how you're feeling at different joints. Like, what, my hip was a little bit sore this morning. My knee was a little bit sore, whatever it is. I didn't feel like I had very much power. I was sloppy off the ground. I was flat, whatever it is. I was just didn't feel good. And I think that's important, from a human body perspective. It's also important from like a sleep and a mental health standpoint. And that's, it's really tough to like we can, we can silo things. And I can't remember who it was, but I was listening to somebody talk, and they were like, the most, the the biggest, crime, and that they felt, or the biggest wrongdoing was that we, in healthcare, we separated mental and physical health. Because it's all this, it's all the same. It's one, everything you, if you're dealing with pain, you, to an extent, you're dealing with the brain, sometimes to a larger extent, sometimes to a smaller extent.
It's the
You can
only
have,
place that it's registering.
yeah, and that's exactly it. You can have a huge amount of pain and no tissue damage, no structural damage. And you can have huge structural damage and you can have no pain. And um, so yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think it's so important. And I always felt like that was something that was one of my biggest strengths. I had some big injuries, but I felt overall that I had pretty good durability. I was fairly strong in a lot of ways. I could handle volume, and I think a lot of that was just, you know my ability to differentiate. And I got it wrong a couple times, but more often than not, my ability to differentiate, this is an ache versus this is a pain. This is something that I'm going to run through, and it's going to get better over the next few days, and I can modify little things, versus this is something that I actually should probably just take 3 days off, and get in the pool. And granted, I had a good, even when I was worried and I thought it was a pain, I was very bad at doing that. I tended to be like let's go until it's really bad. Um, so I certainly could have done that better. But I knew, I knew a lot of people, teammates in college, teammates in high school, who you just didn't have that. It was kind of like, oh, no, this hurts, so I have to stop. And I have a hard stop with running. Um, and without really being able to kind of give those, you know, to kind of dive into that and just say like, well, what's actually going on? Like, how is it feeling? Is this something that's warming up as I go? Like maybe we're stopping before we give it a chance to do a little bit better, because a lot of things have a warm up period where you're like, yeah, it sucks the first mile, and it feels better, until you go too long, and you just like, you kind of have to listen to your body at that to dial in the right volume and intensity. Um, so, because I mean, we can go through, I talked to you about this a little bit, but like we can go through the, each individual muscle group. And I think that's, sometimes I like to start with that with people, because they, you know, they, they don't pay attention, or they don't, think that strength training is important and all this stuff. And, maybe it's not always the most important thing for everybody to do at every given point, but like the forces that are going through your body and running are high. Um, and if you don't have, if you don't have some kind of a relationship with your body where you can tell maybe when things are not starting to feel so great, and at least put up a caution flag and say, well, we're going to monitor this, right? And if it kind of follows this pattern of like, yeah, it's more of like an ache, it gets better as we run, and it's not getting worse over time, just need to give it some time, and natural history will take its place, that's great, versus the opposite, where it's like, hey, this is just getting a little worse, like it doesn't warm up, it gets worse as we run. um I mean, it's just like, just through like the soleus, one muscle of your calf complex, you're taking 6 to 7 times your body weight each stride that you're making, um just in terms of a magnitude there. So, having the ability to kind of listen to that and know like, hey, this is, it's a beautiful activity. It's a great activity in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of things that, can go wrong. And, you can choose to ignore that for a while, and you might get away with it for a time. But there will come a point in time that you don't, and that you, especially if you're trying to compete and you know, be on that kind of, riding that red line. that's an inevitability. You try to maintain within that red line, but sometimes you cross it and you don't know it, for 6 weeks, and then something pops up, and that's really, I think that that's maybe another pertinent point, is that a lot of running related injuries are not instant gratification. I don't even know if that's a good word, because it's not gratification, but they don't pop up. It's not like you made a mistake in a workout and then the next day, that's where you feel it. Even with bone stress injuries, it tends to be like 4 to 6 weeks. So, a lever that you pulled maybe too quickly or too hard 4 to 6 weeks prior is kind of what precipitates that. And then you kind of get hit with it. And then it can be confusing, because you're looking and saying like, well, I didn't feel like I did anything, like I didn't do a workout that, and it was like, no, you didn't, but you went from running, you know, only easy miles to doing, 20 miles of hard volume within a 2 week period. And, your body wasn't super happy with that. So it's so multifactorial that when from an individual lens, like it's almost impossible to keep up with if you don't have some inventory of what's going on in your body and what you've been doing from a training standpoint. And it's challenging for coaches and healthcare professionals to work with you too, when you're coming in and it's just like, yeah, I don't know, so that's kind of where that's kind of how I guess I feel about it. I don't know if that was, a
That's
very
great. I think,
comprehensive answer, but
one of the things we'll be doing in this project is continuing to unpack principles, ideas, overall overarching ways of handling things, and then also dealing in the specific. Now, of course, as we said at the beginning of this episode, there's disclaimers that need to be made relative to this, but ultimately the rubber meets where we'll be talking about both the big picture, but also where the rubber meets the road as we're going on in these episodes. And I think what was most important in this episode, and I think we did a great job of it, is just showing where you're standing, honoring your legacy, where you came from, your bona fides as an athlete and as a physical therapist. And I think ultimately what I think we probably should do in the next episode is sort of take in Carl's top 5 principles, or maybe one at a time. We can do that, in which we say, what are the biggest picture issues that a self-coached athlete should be thinking about, especially, or even the coached athlete whose coach is not, because almost very few coaches are interfacing, especially at the adult level. They're not interfacing with their athlete's body. They're interfacing much more with their athlete's ability to do work, and not necessarily thinking about that gap that a physical therapist or a manual practitioner or someone sits in that space in between. And that's really what I want to do, is just sort of unpack for every athlete, but especially the self-coached athlete, just, are there blind spots here that you need to be thinking about and considering, and where do they sit and how do they sit? Because they're really important. So, and
yeah,
Andy has decided that this is nearing the end and the conclusion of this
yeah,
episode. Yeah.
yeah. She's got something going. She's usually pretty calm, but she's not happy with me right now. So
Well, I think we got it covered a lot. And so, is there anything you want to sort of end with or talk through? Or
um,
should we just let Andy have a,
we'll see if we're gonna
yeah, we'll get
see
her
if
to
we can
calm
get her
down. We'll take a
to
pause.
take a deep breath here. Um, yeah, no, I mean, I think that I'd have trouble kind of consolidating all that into one piece of information, but I think that and this is a theme we'll dive into a little bit more, but I think, overall people view, I think we're really bad about, siloing things and viewing it as like, I got injured, what was the one factor that caused that?
Mm.
And if you really dive into the research on, certainly pain, I think that pain has a lot of, good research around it. Pain and injury is that like every single one is so multifactorial and complex, that it's rare. A fixer, I encourage people to not necessarily go to people looking for them to fill that role, because ultimately you're responsible for you. And you can find really good people to help facilitate that, and kind of guide that journey or teach you things that you need along the way. Um, but at the end of the day, you're responsible for you, and just starting to kind of take stock in that and learn what that means, and what all goes into that. I'm still figuring it out. I don't know how to, it's amazing that I have two children that are still alive, at this phase, because we're learning all the time. But I do think it's, you know, there is a personal responsibility to be able to do that if you want to have like a positive and long running career and journey.
Yeah, I just think it's a non-negotiable ultimately. And to me, that's one of the reasons why this project exists, is that there are so many responsibilities an athlete has, whether they're coached or not. And just because you don't step into your responsibility doesn't mean that you're not going to be held accountable for the thing you didn't do. And that accountability will usually show up either through an injury or through a lot of nervousness before a race, or the inability to reach the depths of your power and personal drive in a race, or your inability to unpack the event afterwards and determine what aspect was going on or not going on that was impactful. And I think these are the things, when most running podcasts that I have listened to are not bringing this holistic piece to the puzzle. They're breaking issues down. And I think that while we will break issues down, we also do need to keep in mind that the definition of complexity is that things are interrelated at a deep level. And maybe while we can't get 100% pure signal from noise, much of what's going on, especially from a nervous system perspective, is going on beyond our ability to actually be aware of. However, we have a greater capacity for awareness than we realize, but it requires us to pay attention and to listen and to create the kind of space necessary for those messages and those signals to come through. And I think that that's what I'm so excited about generally with the oyo.run project, but especially in working with you, is this part that many people feel is beyond their control is a less beyond their control than they're aware of. And it doesn't require some woo idea of the ability to be telepathic or hyper intuitive, or it really is part of our legacy as humans. Is we did have the ability for a much longer period of time to pay attention and really listen and have an awareness that's much greater than we're aware of, because of the last 150 or 400 years of the way we learn now and the way we pattern reality and the way things work. So, that's a big topic of mine that I'm very interested in, is going back to some of these superpowers that we may have had that really aren't super. They're not supernatural. They're actually highly natural. We've just lost our connection to them. And this is a place we stand on different sides of the woo quotient, usually you and I, but we're on the same page to say, hey, there's relevant intel here that you need to gain access to. And I'm really excited about the ways that you'll be able to help us track that from your perspective as a professional. So really excited about how our episodes play out over time. And I'm just thankful that you and Andy have been willing to grace us with your presence, and excited to see where this goes next.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited about it. I think that this is going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for keeping me in mind. I got to give you a little bit of a hard time, and that, the first time you reached out to me, I only had one kid. So you waited until it was double duty to get me to buckle up and do this. But no, it should be a good time. It should be fun.
As I'm sure, oh, I lost him.